With the end of World War II, we see a time when the entire globe is really engaged in the push and pull between democracy and communism, between the United States and the Soviet Union. And we see this push and pull play out in the Korean conflict, in the development of NATO. We see that even as the Second World War had raged on, there was much division globally. The end of the Second World War was a time of change in our nation's history, and some of those changes were very important and positive and should not be understated. World War II transformed the American economy and the American family life, putting women in the workplace and providing new opportunities for women's advancement. Some feared that the transformation of the social and cultural patterns and gender roles that took place during the war would place American society in peril, but those fears amounted to very little. Many people were very concerned that because women's roles had shifted significantly during the Second World War, that the American family or the idealized American family would be undermined and destroyed. In order to provide opportunities for World War II veterans, Congress passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944 to provide educational and financial support for servicemen. In spite of this effort, there were many economic hurdles that remained. Truman initially fought the labor unions and found it difficult to maintain his predecessor's relationship with labor. In 1947, Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which made it difficult for unions to strike, but this was passed over Truman's veto. The Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, began to work to challenge racial exclusion. CORE fought for the right of African Americans to vote and have equal access to public accommodations and drew on Black post-war empowerment. In spite of having fought a war for democracy, violent resistance to Black social change took place in the post-war years. Race riots, lynching, and political intimidation consumed the South. In response to the violence, Truman created the President's Committee on Civil Rights in 1946 to investigate and provide him with information. In 1947, the committee issued a report entitled "To Secure These Rights." This report prompted Truman to desegregate the armed forces. Now, it's important to keep in mind that even though African Americans served in segregated units during the Second World War, what they were fighting for was freedom that they didn't enjoy fully in their home country. And many of these veterans of the Second World War who were African American, when they returned to the United States after the war, refused to go to the Black lunch counter. They refused to sit in the back of the bus, and they refused to be second-class citizens. Truman's support for civil rights generated resentment among white Southerners who created a states' rights party called the Dixiecrats. Truman's administration of the Cold War generated criticism from the left, leading former Roosevelt Vice President Henry Wallace to run for president on a Progressive Party ticket. Truman appealed to the centrists by offering them a fair deal platform, advocating national health insurance, federal aid for education, and reforms to agriculture. On this platform, Truman won the presidency. The term vital center liberalism was coined by historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Vital center liberalism reflected the late 1940s trend toward liberal collaboration with business and economic interests and fervent support for the Cold War, civil rights, and the expansion of programs. So we see a meshing of business with the progressives and the liberal of the day. And we see these groups working together to support the United States' efforts to stamp out communism around the world, but also to advocate for civil rights. We also see that these groups begin to work together to advocate for a variety of social programs. This is a time of great change in American history. In 1938, the New Deal critics formed the House Committee on Un-American Activities. In 1940, Roosevelt actually signed the Smith Act, which prohibited the teaching or advocating the overthrow of the government by violence or force. Now, the purpose of this House Committee on Un-American Activities was to investigate any type of subversive activity, any type of activity that might undermine American values, American morale. The Federal Employee Loyalty Program was developed and monitored and investigated the political activities of federal employees and resulted in an Attorney General's list of suspicious organizations and individuals. Remember, through the Second World War, and really even earlier, way back in World War I, we start to see that immigrants who have not fully assimilated to the United States are easy targets, and they are often tried and convicted of crimes or deported or executed without significant or any evidence. We also see that people who begin to have varying political views become targets as well. Though espionage was a distinct problem for the United States, the Loyalty Board focused on the political views of individuals whose petitions were outside of the mainstream. So they really looked for people who did not identify with the dominant political ideologies of the day. The board dismissed 378 individuals from their jobs because they were suspected of being disloyal to the United States. Popular culture and film also came under attack during the Red Scare of the early Cold War. In 1947, 10 Hollywood filmmakers and performers were blacklisted for their political views and their unwillingness to cooperate with the House Committee on Un-American Activities. In 1948, the House Committee on Un-American Activities investigated former State Department official Alger Hiss after a former Soviet spy, Whittaker Chambers, accused Hess of espionage. Richard Nixon, who was a congressman at the time, kept this case alive, and Hiss was eventually sentenced to 5 years in prison. Now, as a result of this, it made Democrats appear to be soft on communism, and this was a loaded charge in the midst of the Cold War. So they were called red, as in, red communists. They might be called pink, as in they had some communist sympathies. And Democrats, even though, Democrats were the party of Roosevelt, the concern here was that Roosevelt had garnered this great relationship with Stalin, and therefore Democrats might be willing to accept some of Stalin's views as part of their own party platform. Now, in 1950, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were indicted and convicted of providing the Soviet Union with information about the atomic bomb. They were sentenced to death by electrocution in the electric chair. Now, in spite of vast opposition to their execution, they ended up being the sentence stood because they refused to confess. And they had been offered, a deal that said if they would confess that they would be spared from electrocution. But they dismissed that and said that they were not willing to confess to something that they had not done, and that if dying by execution was the punishment for that, then they were willing to accept that punishment. Out of the anxieties of the early Cold War, Republicans and Democrats promoted legislation outlawing communism, restricting civil rights and civil liberties, and limiting the ability of the unions to organize and lead and engage in protests. Between 1950 and 1957, Joseph McCarthy became the face of the anti-communism movement of the day. Joseph McCarthy had built a reputation as the head of the Permanent Investigation Subcommittee of the Committee of Government Operations, and he made a lot of very wild accusations about communist activity. And some of it was true. There was some truth in a lot of what he said, but a lot of what he said was also completely false. And he really did a fantastic job of accusing a lot of people of being communist and not providing evidence to support his claims. In 1950, McCarthy gave a speech in West Virginia in which he declared that he had evidence of 205 men who worked for the State Department and had communist ties. Now, McCarthy's tactics really drummed up a lot of anti-communist fervor, but it also generated a lot of widespread hysteria. People were paralyzed with fear that their neighbor might be a communist, that their minister might be a communist, that the immigrant who cuts their meat at the butcher might be a communist. And this really drives a lot of paranoia, and it leads to a lot of people making accusations and informing on their neighbors. Though McCarthy's tactics emphasized a lot of false accusations, he really became synonymous with the anti-communist sentiment. It is important to always keep in mind that some of his accusations were true. McCarthy went beyond the boundaries of acceptable discourse in 1954 when he accused the military of harboring communists in forts across the country. The Army McCarthy hearings illustrated his inability to support his accusations and ultimately ended up in him being censured by the Senate. After 1954, anti-communism does remain a prominent part of American politics, and Congress passed the Communist Control Act to push groups with communist influence to register with the United States government. The FBI generated continued anxiety about communism and kept the fervor alive even after McCarthy's political demise. So we do see some important positive things that take place at the end of the Second World War, with an increase in activism from African Americans seeking rights that they have fought and died for in Europe, being granted to them at home in the United States. But we also see a great time of mistrust from our neighbors as we are engaged in this 20-year, 30-year Cold War push and pull balancing act between the United States and the Soviet Union, during which time we see the Korean conflict and other events like the Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs, issues in Latin America, which we will cover in a future chapter. Thanks.